This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and today our guest is Melanie Bell. Melanie is the founder of Leaders Who Fiction, an online book club and community that offers a unique way for people to acquire and develop leadership qualities through reading and discussing novels. On this fast-growing platform, leaders meet on the last Wednesday of each month for intellectual, business-oriented conversations centered around a selected novel. Melanie is also the co-founder of Strategic Peace, where she works with C-suite executives at growth stage companies to deliver exceptional revenue growth by bringing together their marketing, sales, and service teams around an information-driven customer experience built on the HubSpot platform. She has been an entrepreneur for almost a decade and witnessed a great deal of what works and doesn't work in leadership, and how reading fiction equips leaders with skills they need to achieve their professional goals. So Melanie, thanks so much for being on the program. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, it's so interesting that when I saw that this is what you do, I'm like, you know how sometimes you think you have an original idea? And I was sitting here, you know, I love to read novels, and I tell people all the time, yeah, I really saw this leadership quality, or it's really cool how this character did this. And they often look at you like, you're reading a novel. I know, but, it just sometimes connects better when it's not formulaic or bullet point or instructional,
Yeah.
You remember the stories better than the facts sometimes. So I'm intrigued about this, your approach to reading novels. So just share with us how this came to be and how you got it started.
Sure. So the first kind of kernel of an idea came to me after I finished business school, which was, I guess, 12 years ago. And a friend of mine had recommended reading this science fiction book called Ender's Game. And I'm not a huge sci-fi person, but it intrigued me. And so I read it, and I just remember sitting on my couch and thinking, this is what we should have been reading in my organizational behavior classes. It was so much more powerful than reading, the memoirs of GE's former CEO, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the first kernel. And like a lot of people, as I was working full-time, my reading dropped off. It was last thing, especially with doing a lot of computer work. At the end of the day, it's like, oh yeah, let me go have to focus on something else with my eyes, just physical strain of that. But I started making a concerted effort to reading more. I had always been a big reader growing up. And as I started reading more, I first of all noticed that I showed up differently as a consultant, and how I interacted with my clients. But also, I would tell people I was reading books like you were just mentioning, and I would regularly get responses from people like, oh my gosh, I can't remember the last time I read a novel, and I really miss reading. And so I felt like, well, if a lot of people feel this way, why not give everyone that excuse and that accountability of reading again?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I got a lot to talk about in that sense, but let's back up just a little bit before we get too far into it here and discuss a little bit about your background for context here. So, where'd you grow up? Where did you go to school? And how did you get to where you are now, just in a summary?
Sure. So I grew up in Houston, Texas, which is where I am now, but I did leave for 8 years. So I lived in England for a year, and I went to college in Canada, and lived there for 7 years. So went to college and worked there. And my background has been in marketing, online businesses, e-commerce, lots of things like that. And after 7 Canadian winters, I was ready to
Yeah.
ready to
Different than Houston.
defrost
Yeah,
a little bit. So I decided to come back to Houston, and that's when I decided to go to business school.
that's great. That's great. Now you're also an angel investor as well, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, um, I guess my question is, how does one become an angel investor? I mean, you gotta have some money, obviously, and then you've
Yeah.
also have to be able to know businesses and study businesses well enough to not just make it gambling, right?
Yes. So when I finished business school, I started working for a startup accelerator. So it was kind of like super early venture capital. And we would put the startups through a 3-month program, and we would invest and take an small equity amount in each of those companies. And so through that job, I was the director of marketing for this accelerator, but through that job, I really met a lot of people who are all venture capitalists, corporate venture capitalists, a lot of entrepreneurs. I've heard hundreds of startups pitching, have coached startups. And so that was kind of how I got my foot in the door of learning about angel investing.
Interesting. And I also see that you mentor students at Rice University for innovation and entrepreneurship. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit what that looks like.
Yeah. So the main way that I'm mentoring at the moment is Rice has several different entrepreneurship classes available to students, and it takes student teams through the process of founding a company. And it's a really neat program because it puts an emphasis on testing the idea and deciding whether or not there's actually a business that's there. And so they bring in people who are founders or part of the entrepreneurial ecosystem here. And we work with a couple of the student teams throughout the program and give them feedback on how is their market research going and their market validation. What assumptions do they need to be testing next? We just kind of hand walk them through that process.
And are they coming forward with some pretty creative ideas and some new business ideas about that we might think are crazy, but who knows, might become a billion-dollar company someday?
Yep. There are always those ideas. It's kind of funny because there are also ideas where it's like I think it's really common for university students to feel certain pain points and nobody has really solved those. And so sometimes you see the same idea getting tackled multiple times by different teams over the years. But yeah, there are always some really, really cool ideas that students come up with as well.
That's awesome. Well, let's get back to the fiction then, leaders who fiction. So, um, just tell me that, I mean, in thinking about this and my own interest in it, it's kind of like I consider myself, I guess, more of a right brain thinker than a left brain thinker. And so reading novels, even though they're not true, they're fiction, but you can pick up things about how to be a leader and what's worked and what doesn't. And and it's just you can remember that story sometimes better than you can remember a statement or a quote or a fact. So just tell me, kind of your idea of what this is, and then I'm interested in how it works from a, mechanical way as well.
Sure. So I think one of the interesting things that I've found through researching, because I was wondering, is this just some crazy idea of mine that there's a connection between these things?
Yeah.
But from a neuroscience perspective, when we read, our brains shift into a simulation mode. And so we talk about, okay, it's novels are a chance to walk around in a character's shoes, but our brains have really made that full switch. We are actually walking around in that character's world. And so I think we will viscerally remember and interact with those stories so differently than we would say if we were watching a movie or talking about something, or you brought up the example, it's like if we were reading business books with bullet points, that's a really different experience than this simulation mode that we go into.
So you're suggesting from a neuroscience perspective that when our brains are reading the story and we're engaged with that character, it's almost as if it's happening to us.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do you choose the books that you're going to read? I mean, do you have to read all the books that are on the platform?
Well, I do read all of them, but I don't always read them in advance of me picking them.
Okay.
So I do get recommendations from other people who are a part of the group. Um, People will read a book and say, "Hey, I think this would be a really good fit for us." I try to make sure that all of the books aren't very long, just because I am conscientious that we're all really busy people, and to make sure that we're getting through a book, I try to be sensitive about the length of a book. And then I
So
try to
so
keep
the
it.
Count of Monte Cristo probably wouldn't be up for
It won't make it. Les Miserables not going to be on the list.
that. Okay.
Great books to read. I'm not knocking them, but I think that would be ambitious to finish in 1 month with
Yeah.
what everybody else has got going on their plate.
Sure.
Yeah. And then I try to keep an even balance between, male authors, female authors, and where people come from and that kind of stuff, just to make sure we've got a variety of voices and a variety of genres that we read.
Yeah, and I think that's real important. I mean, I purposely sometimes, as a male, get caught up in male authors sometimes, and then I say, no, I'm gonna very intently read a female author because they just, you just look at things in a different way and describe things in a
Hmm.
different way or have different perceptions. So I think that diversity is good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So share with us, if you will, if you're willing to, I don't know if you call it endorsing these, but what are some books that you can think of off the top of your head that you thought really had powerful leadership messages in them and that you got a lot from?
Sure. So one of the books that we read was called Parable of the Sower. It's Sower by Octavia Butler. And it was first published back in I want to say the 80s or 90s, but I think it was the 80s. And it's a post-apocalyptic book. And it's a teenager who is reacting to current events and figuring out how she is going to survive. And as she goes along, she's making a journey from where she lives in Los Angeles up to Northern California, and that's where they're going to go live. And she kind of amasses friends and followers along the way that are going to help her survive. And I think that's been one book that had a lot of really good leadership lessons in it. Another fun one we read was The Final Revival of Opal and Nev, and it's by an author called Donnie Walton, and it's about a band that was a rock and roll band in the 60s, and it's got a dual timeline. So part of it takes place today, part of it takes place in the 60s. But there's a lot of talk about kind of the band's leadership as well as the studio records leadership and that kind of thing. And so there are a bunch of different contrasting leadership styles that are in that book. And that was a really good discussion that we had
Oh,
around that
that's
one
awesome.
too.
No, I think you just bring that up. I'm always looking for leadership moments in whatever genre, and I have interviewed, in the music world, a few people because being a leader of a band is some extreme leadership. I mean,
Yeah.
you got all these creative minds behind you, and everybody, wants their piece of it and whatever. And the bands that stick together for a long time with the same members, are an impressive unit to look at and figure out how they do that because the norm is that they don't last very long.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's amazing. So if I'm in this group, are most of your members, do they come on every month or do they kind of come and go? Like, maybe I'll read a book and then I'll be on this month and maybe 6 months later I'll come back and do one, or do they go all the way through every month?
We have both. I'd say it's about 50-50 between people I mean, we've got a couple members we're in our third year and they have not missed a single meeting, which is really impressive. And I mean, I think it's impressive. I haven't missed it, but I'm the organizer, so I kind of have to be there. They don't have to be. Um, and then other people choose to come every couple of months. We've had some people who come regularly and just receive promotions or had, job upheaval and will fall off and come back and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. Like you said, when we get busy and we're in our business lives or whatever, there's that often thought of, well, I don't have time to read. But
Yeah.
if because reading can be an escape too, as far as decreasing stress or whatever. But then if you can learn something with it as well, it may be easier to justify that I'm reading a novel if I'm super busy person.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the nice things. I feel like any accountability group has that kind of built-in function for you, which is like, oh, I've got people who I've said I'm going to read this book at the end of the month. So hopefully it gives kind of an extra incentive for people to prioritize the
So you
reading.
you personally facilitate each one of those every month?
I do. With this month, we have our meeting next week, and it's the first time we're trying this, but I'm trying. We have someone who's going to co-host the meeting with me, so I'm really excited to see how that goes.
Like anything, as it grows and gets bigger, there's only one of you, so you need to find a way to leverage it and get other
Yeah,
people involved, I'm sure. Yeah.
yeah.
So is this if you don't mind me asking, do you make money on this, or is this just totally a voluntary thing, or how does that work?
So right now, totally voluntary. At some point, it would be great to figure out how to monetize it, but it's not there yet. So right now, it's just figuring out, all of the kinks and making this work and getting people excited about the idea.
And do you have authors or brokers of authors contacting you saying, I'd really like my book in this forum?
I haven't so far, but that'd be a really good goal.
Well, I will tell you that I think that that's probably coming, because as soon as it gets better known and people are doing it, it's people want to be on those platforms where they
They
can
do.
expand their reach, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
interesting. I have a personal story. So I went to physical therapy school in Chicago, Illinois, and where the school was at Northwestern was the physical therapy school was in downtown Chicago. But my wife and I lived in Evanston, which is about an hour north on the L train. So I said, "Oh, this will be fantastic. I'll get to study, 2 hours a day on the train." And when you
Mhm.
open up technical books and information that you're trying to learn, I could not concentrate because there's too much going on the train and too much distraction and whatever. And I thought, well, this isn't going to work. And for some odd reason, I said, well, I think I'll just read a novel. So I started reading a novel, and I don't know what the difference is, but when I got into that novel, I mean, the next thing I knew, I was at my stop. And
Right.
it just took me completely out of that. And so I find it very interesting, why could I concentrate so deeply reading the novel, but when I was trying to study more technical things, it just wasn't there.
Hmm.
You got a good answer for that?
I just think it's so dependent on the person for how you consume information versus other people, because I mean we've got some people in our group who are big fans of audiobooks, and personally I can only listen to nonfiction and audiobooks. In fiction I really struggle with it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but other people have no problem with it, and that's how they engage better with it, and that's what fits their lifestyle. So um it might just be a
Yeah. Yeah.
personal thing.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because I didn't think of it before, but I can get very engrossed in an audible book too, where I know
Mhm.
other people say, God, my mind races all the time and I'm off thinking something here and then I've missed, a number of pages of the book. And so, some people struggle with it. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so it sounds like what you believe then is reading fiction and leadership development kind of coexist. They can be the same thing. And I think that's a concept that intrigued me, as I said at the beginning of this, because I don't think that most people would think of it that way. So I commend you for putting the two together because to me it's a really interesting concept.
Thank you. Yeah. It's I didn't have my first management position. I didn't have a lot of training with it. And I was told to go read psychology books. And I view this as just kind of one more tool that we have at our disposal that maybe people haven't thought of before.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've talked a lot on the show with other people about this, and I believe this wholeheartedly, is that I think that storytelling, a good storyteller, is a great leader, can be a
Yes.
great leader, because again, you just go back to the basics. Think of keynote speakers or think of people that are trying to get a message across. I can tell you what I think the answer is, or I can tell you, the facts and the figures and the dates and the timelines, but nobody remembers that. But if I can tell you a really good story where you're really engaged in it, you can go home and tell somebody that story. You can repeat the story.
Yeah.
But I challenge anybody to go repeat the bullet points and the facts and the figures and whatever that were saying the same thing. So I think it's a very strong leadership quality that I think that people that are good storytellers often can be good leaders with that trait.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
So tell us a little bit about you're also co-founder of Strategic Peace. So tell us what that is and how that came to be and what are you doing with it?
Sure. So I started working for myself almost 10 years ago, doing marketing technology and marketing strategy consulting. It was under a different brand name at the time. And then my husband is now my business partner. And when we were making that decision to start working together, we rebranded as Strategic Peace. His background is C-level. He's been a CEO of a few different companies. And so his background's more strategy and technical stuff, although I've kind of converted him into a marketer. And so we work with early stage or growth stage companies, have got some sales under their belt so they know what it takes from a customer perspective to get that sale. And then we work with them to scale up their marketing. So a lot of it's like fractional marketing, leadership, but we do get into the technology side of it as well.
Do you believe that anyone can become a good leader, or do you think there's some people that just can't quite get there?
A good leader, I think if people are very intentional about it and have a lot of self-awareness, I think anyone could be a good leader. I don't think everyone could be a great leader.
Yeah, I've shared the story before, but I'll tell it again. So, I, as a young CEO, felt that if I just put enough time and energy into anybody, that they could become a leader. And so I liked how you described it, good versus great, because the harsh reality is I did come to realize that, some people just aren't wired to get to that great level, and I think it's
Yeah.
fewer than most of us would think. But, some people that just, whether it's too much about me, or not understanding the bigger concepts or whatever it is, it's just, a struggle to get to that next level. For
Yeah.
other people, I strongly believe in leadership development programs because if they just have some guidance and some help and some, here's my experiences and here's what I learned, and maybe you can learn from that. I do think you can develop impressive leaders.
Yeah. And I think one of the things is that they have to want it. And I've definitely met people who are not interested in being a leader. They want somebody else to make the decisions and have that accountability. And that's fine too.
Yeah.
We need those people.
Well, you need followers as well as leaders. Although in our society today, I think the word follower has a negative connotation to it. And
Yeah.
you can be a great team member and be more of a follower without it being, some negative connotation.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So how do leaders ensure that, change initiatives that you're coaching them on in their companies or whatever, um, uh, get to their employees and they understand it too? So what is the secret sauce in getting employees engaged in these change initiatives that sometimes need to take place?
So I think one of the first things is really that impactful communication. And so I think, going back to that, what is the power of storytelling, I think has a real role in that. But I think just even being a solid communicator, both listener and a speaker, how to get your point across, um, is super important. And I think that one of the things that for people who I would consider people who wanted to be a really good leader but fell short of that mark were short on a lot of the soft skills. So they were short on empathy, they were short on listening, they were short on kind of just that human component that we can bring to the table,
Yeah,
that I think really make an impact on whether people are going to get on board with changes or be reluctant about it or be detractors from those initiatives.
yeah, and sometimes I believe, because I think this is in my own story too, that sometimes the best leaders are your reluctant leaders. Sometimes you have to
Mm-hmm.
be a little afraid of the person that just wants to be the leader. That's the main goal is I want to be the boss and I want to be the leader, and maybe they want to do that for the wrong reasons. But sometimes the skilled, soft skills person, as you described, or the person that can really listen and really get people together, um, maybe have to be coaxed a little bit to get into those leadership roles that carry a lot more responsibility and weight on their shoulders.
Yeah. And I think so much of that comes from practice. I mean, I think to a certain amount, to a certain extent, some of it can be innate, but I just keep thinking back to the first time I was a manager and all the mistakes that I made when I was doing that. And, I think what was lost on me was I wasn't just going to step into this new role and get it right all the time.
Yeah,
Um, that it is a lot of practice and failure and getting better at it and learning from your mistakes.
absolutely. And it's just, I think, for people to be motivated and inspired, in this world that we're in today, which is so pushing us to be black and white, it's either you're either this or that, and everybody wants, the exact answer. And sometimes it's, how reassuring would it be for a young leader to be asked a question, say, I don't really know the answer to that, but maybe we should research it together and let's figure it out. And, I mean, I think when we're put in those leadership positions, we think that we have to always have the answers. And anyone
Hmm.
with any experience knows, as you just said, we don't know all the answers. We make mistakes, and we just need to be humble enough to recognize that and take some input and learn from our mistakes.
Yeah. And it's learning the questions to ask more than learning the answers.
Yeah, absolutely. And being
Yeah.
vulnerable enough or brave enough to ask the questions, which may indicate you don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Um, Again, as a younger leader, I can remember being afraid to ask some questions sometimes because then I would think, oh, that person's going to know I'm clueless on this, and that's not what a leader should be, you know.
Exactly.
But
Exactly. And, just to tie this back to the fiction that we were talking about earlier, I think one of the cool things when you read a business book, and even the ones that do a good job on telling stories, the stories tend to be very black and white. And so by the time as you're reading this, what's happening, it's kind of obvious what the person in that story should be doing. And in fiction, a good writer should be having a ton of gray area in the story. Ethical dilemmas, moral dilemmas, what should the character do next? Their pros and cons. And I think that's so much closer to what we encounter in real life and at work, that I just think that's really powerful in terms of getting comfortable with that ambiguity.
absolutely, you said it perfectly. Think of many books that you read about, the lead character who's agonizing over this decision or this thing that happened and what they go through and this, I mean, it goes on pages and pages and pages of this stuff where, in a typical leadership book, it's like, okay, you hear this, you do that, you do this, there's not all that, um, what has to occur within us both brain wise and heart wise to get to some of the decisions that we finally have to make.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just I think that's really interesting. I gave a speech on the national scene one time. It's an organization I was with, and the title of it was "I Believe in the Gray," because
Mm.
we're just so pushed towards black and white, and it I always like the word it depends, like, oh, well, if you think this, then you must think that. And I go, well, that's not a reasonable conclusion. It depends, it depends on this and that. And so I think society pushes us to want to be in the black and white, where I think good leaders need to be comfortable in the gray, you
Yeah,
know. So
definitely.
yeah, that's really interesting. So talk a little too about the relationship between reading and writing. And again, I have my own opinions about it, but I'm sure that in writing, I mean, how we communicate with people, whether it's through email or memos or some kind of a document, describing strategy and how reading affects that.
Yeah. I mean, I think just from my own personal experience, I can speak about that. That was one of the ways I noticed that I started showing up differently with my clients as I started reading more. I think I mean, I feel bad. I can look back at some emails and be like, oh, I can tell which book I was reading when I wrote that because I've adapted, I've taken on the style of that author um, in my emails. But I just think that in terms of clarity of thought and directness, or providing context, we just get a better sense because we've been digesting so much from a reading perspective. And in a lot of books now, especially if you're reading books that take place today, they'll include, as part of the narrative, they'll include emails as in the stories or text messages or social media posts or that kind of thing. And so I don't think we're just seeing paragraphs of text
Yeah.
anymore, at least from books that are coming out now. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the written word is powerful, and
it
somebody who can
is.
really put it together and make it eloquent and make it clear, but said in a way that's not judgmental or in your face or questioning your motives. It's just done in a way. I think there's a real skill to that, and obviously, good
Mm-hmm.
novelists have that wired. And a lot of times, in the book clubs like the book club I'm in now, when I go to book club, I'll often bring, lines like, one or two or three lines in a row, just like, and read it and just say, listen to this. I mean, one, how do
Yeah.
they think of the metaphors and how do they think of the things, but how eloquent is this to make the point as opposed to just saying, this is this, I think it makes a
Yeah.
difference. And I think people respond to that.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. It's
I
just
agree.
really, really interesting. So,
Yeah.
what have you found? Like you're in the entrepreneur world and teach people in that world and whatever, and give us some lessons that you've learned not only as an entrepreneur but also a woman in the entrepreneurial world.
Ooh, that's a big question. um, so I think some of the lessons that I've learned. Um, so I think the biggest thing, and I'm trying to, my stepkids are 17 and 20, so they're early, they've got jobs, but early jobs. And one of the things I keep hammering them on is trusting their own gut and listening to their intuition. And if something seems off, it's off, and it's okay. You don't have to justify it to anybody. I think like most women that are involved in the startup scene, we've got stories of really bizarre comments people have made to us over the years um, that lacked professionalism. So, but I think what it really came back to every time for me was I didn't listen to my own intuition um, about what if something was uncomfortable, then I should have listened to that. So that's one thing. I think one thing that I've figured out was that the support that I was looking for as an entrepreneur, as a female entrepreneur, was different than the support I've seen male entrepreneurs look for. And so for me, I've been really getting connected into especially online communities of other women entrepreneurs. And that was a huge help in growing my business because the content was geared a little bit differently. The topics were geared a little bit differently. Whereas the male entrepreneurs that I would see would be very focused on the strategies, the KPIs, the nuts and bolts of the business. And then the women's groups that I've been a part of was focused on community, getting out of your own way, a lot of that imposter syndrome, more mindset stuff. So it's been kind of interesting to watch that and see those differences play out.
So if you have learned from that and so on, do you go into a situation now with intention and a strategy of being more like this than that? I mean, do you think ahead of time to do that, or do you still think it's more powerful just being who you are?
I think I'm more okay with being who I am, but I feel like I have an easier time recognizing. So like, for instance, when it comes to angel investing and I'm listening to pitches or meeting with founder teams, I have a different perspective on who they are, what's important to them, what's keeping them up at night, than I previously did. And seeing personalities kind of play out together, just a little bit of a different perspective there.
Yeah, and we're talking about generalizations here, and that's always a little dangerous. But I interviewed a woman for this program who's head of women's studies at Northwestern University, and she was talking a lot about how, generally speaking, men and women look at things differently. And the example she gave was, let's say you're looking at a potential job, and the listing of the job criteria, there's 10 of them. And if a male, sees maybe 5 or maybe 6, like, oh, I could do that. I'll figure out the rest.
Right.
They'll just go for it. Where women, generally speaking, I got to get 8 or 9 of these and be comfortable with that before I go for that step, and less likely to wing it, I guess is the thing to say. And she said that she talks with a lot of women that she coaches, like, be willing to wing it more. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all these things before you take the step, because you're going to miss opportunities that way.
Yeah. I think one of the other interesting things that I've heard is a lot of the hangups. And I mean, I think that so I've heard that about job interviews and job applications before. And it is amazing the difference that those studies have found. In the entrepreneurial world, I feel like I see a lot of women not wanting to charge or get compensation at a fair rate, or there's kind of a difference in expectations that are there between, and again, I hate generalizing, but
Right. Yeah. Well,
there's a lot of that content, a lot of money hangups for women.
Yeah, and it is generalizing, but yet you can learn from that concept. And like I said, I'm in my coaching services, we talk a lot about personality types. And so you go back to your gut feeling, or in this situation where my approach, who I am naturally, may not be the right approach because I'm dealing with a different personality that's not going to resonate with. So sometimes you have to kind of gear up a little bit and say, okay, now I'm going to be a little more like this than I normally am, because then that message is going to get heard better. So I think we have to, realize that too, that, getting back to your gut feel, like nothing will drive a data-driven analytical person more crazy than to have all the facts, all the spreadsheets, everything laid out to make a decision, and you say, well, it just doesn't feel right. That drives me crazy. But that piece is important, because a lot of times the gut does tell you what's right,
Yeah. And I think there's room for both. It's if you're kind of too skewed one one direction or the other, then you're probably getting a bit off balance with it. And I think different situations call for this needs more of a data-driven approach, or, a gut feel is okay to apply here.
Yeah, and there's leadership examples everywhere. When you said you were the stepmother of two, that's a pretty tough leadership situation where you have to maneuver that and deal with all the right brain feeling parts of that, and then give them the instruction they need and so on. That's not an easy world to maneuver through. So I'm sure you can use a lot of your leadership training and skills in that area as well.
Yep, more personal growth.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So, what haven't I touched on about the fiction part of this discussion that needs more discussion?
I think you've covered a lot of it. I'm actually really curious your book recommendations when you said you read novels and pulled out leadership lessons.
Yeah, I should have been prepared for that since I asked you the question. One that comes to mind that I thought was really, really interesting of just, how to maneuver through a impossible situation is A Gentleman in Moscow. If you've read that
Yes.
book, just
So good.
I mean, I love the author, and I've read
Yes.
every one of his books. And you talk about eloquent prose and writing is just unbelievable. But you take a situation like that where most people confined to a hotel for their life would, just not even be able to function. And somehow he just, has relationships with everybody and works them really well. And whether it's the Russian Bolsheviks, or it's the little girl that he befriended, or the chef,
Yeah.
whatever, he just has all these ways of making that life is as good as possible with the circumstances ahead of him. So that's one that comes to mind.
Yeah. I love that book. That's a really good example.
It's a great book. And
Yeah.
yeah, we just trying to think of other ones. I'm in a neighborhood book club, and we get together, and it's just so fun. And like you said too, it's nice to have that. Book club is next Thursday, so I better take some time to read, where it'd be a lot easier just to blow it off, and then
Yeah.
gosh, why didn't I finish that book? So it is
Yeah.
nice to be responsible a little bit for that.
Yeah. I think the other nice thing about book clubs is that you end up reading stuff that you wouldn't pick up on your own to read. And so you end up discovering stuff. You're like, man, I really enjoyed that book, and I never would have read it if just left to my own devices.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you go back to the audible books, audiobooks. There's like, some books, because the readers are so good, and maybe if you're dealing with accents and dialects and whatever, that can read it so well, it almost enhances it, sometimes, in my opinion, where like, oh my gosh, if I saw that word and I read it, it wouldn't sound anything like the reader just read it, So it kind of adds to the book as well. So I think, let's face it, books have lasted the test of time, with all the technology changes and the Kindles and the Audible books and whatever, we're still, people still read, right? It seems like people still read.
People still read.
And I've just witnessed too, as now being a grandparent, for the first time, how kids just love books. Like when you read a kid a book, they're just like mesmerized, and that hasn't changed in centuries. So it's
Yeah. Well, and the amazing thing to me is, and this is when people ask me about audiobooks, I'm like, audiobooks are totally fine. Before there was writing, people would engage in oral storytelling. And it wasn't until recently that we had mass literacy. So say like when Jane Austen or Charles Dickens were writing, they were also writing for a semi-illiterate population.
Yeah.
Those stories were meant to be told out loud, and shared and that kind of thing.
And just even some cultures, through history, storytelling is a very important part of, sitting around the fire in the evening and listening to the elders tell stories and things like that. I think we all enjoy it, but as you mentioned, earlier, we just learn things from it. I mean, it's,
Hmm.
I can't think of anything that I've read where I didn't learn something from it, or otherwise, why would you read it? So,
Right.
yeah, well, it's fascinating. So, when you anticipated our discussion today, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to be sure you get in the program?
The only other thing is that people can find us at leaderswhofiction.com.
Yeah.
And we've got the next 3 months of books on the website. So if people
Okay.
feel like they're a slow reader, they can get ahead on that. And yeah,
Yeah.
that's about it.
Say it one more time. What's the website?
Leaderswhofiction.com.
Fiction.com. All right. Okay, that's great. Well, maybe be on a few more of these podcasts, and you'll have a whole new group coming in, hopefully.
That would be great.
Well, Melanie, usually at this time in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question, and that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
To me, it's make sure that you're showing up as a whole person in your leadership role, and make sure that you're acknowledging other people as whole persons in their roles. I think it was, to me, one of the silver linings of the pandemic was that we got to really, we couldn't ignore the fact that people had whole lives, and that impacted our work and our personal lives. And they so bounce back and forth. We have to interact and just make sure that we're whole people and that we've got hobbies and interests outside of work. And some people have families, some people don't. But I think if we can just keep making sure that we see the humans that we're interacting with, that to me is one of the main leadership things that we can do.
Absolutely. Do you think did we learn during COVID for that? Do you think people are getting better at that, or are we just going back to the way it was once we're over the crisis?
I think it was better. I feel like we might have started reverting back to how it was before.
Well, we've all been on Zoom calls, and we can remember funny images of, the little kid, coming behind,
Yeah.
the dad and doing something like this, or, whatever. So it was reassuring in a lot of ways. And getting back to the personality types, it's the very introverted, data-driven people, not working from home is the greatest thing in the world. This is awesome, but the real social, collaborative, interactive, maybe extroverted people are like, oh my God, I'm going crazy. So,
Yeah.
just understanding that, we're not all the same, and that we have to look for balance and things. It can't just be, this way for one and that way for another. It's a blend for sure. It's being in the gray, as we discussed earlier.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Well, Melanie, this has been a real pleasure. Like I said, I couldn't wait to talk to you about this topic because I think it's unique and different, and I think it's something that people will find interesting, and it can resonate with them. And certainly been a big part of my life. Sounds like it's been a big part of yours as well. So thanks for sharing that with us, and wish you the best of luck with the platform, and keep growing and get more people involved. And hopefully we'll see you down the road.
Thank you. Sounds good.
Okay. Take care, Melanie.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.